Welcome to the Ask Sensei Tony podcast, where Sensei will address your questions about life from the cosmic perspective. Please subscribe and ask a question at AskSenseiTony.com to find out more about studying with Sensei privately, becoming a part of our spiritual community, and training to become a mindful minister of oneness in our seminary. We hope you enjoy this episode and find it helpful.
Hi everyone, I'm Sensei Tony, and today's question comes from Meg, and she asks, what do the quantum science teachings teach us about the nature of consciousness and the potential interdependence of all things? So what is quantum science teaching us about the nature of consciousness and the potential interdependence of all things? Thank you for your question, Meg. Well, as you know, one of the things that I'm very, very much about is the relationship between science and spirituality. And my most recent book, The Three Principles of Oneness, How to Embody the Cosmic Perspective and Liberate Your Life, really focuses on this dynamic. And without kind of going into that whole the whole topic, which is very deep and complex and important, I will just simply say that, a basic sort of summary for me is that we need to be able to communicate why things matter with how things work. And so we need to be able to communicates in spiritual principles or important concepts about why things matter, and do that through the language of our technology, which is science. And if we can't do that, then at some point, I believe that spirituality loses its power to transform. And it becomes a belief system that we then have to either defend against sometimes what we know about the universe technologically, scientifically, or you kind of relegate it to a largely sort of feeling sort of approach to things, and or make it irrational in some way. And I just don't think ultimately that's going to work. I think people find lots of ways to experience certain things without referring to spiritual concepts necessarily. And I think that if you get into this fundamentalist game where you're trying to defend a religious teaching when it makes no sense in light of science, it's not going to work. It's not working. And as I always say, when you want to know something, you just look at the evidence around you. And it's pretty evident that well-organized religion still has a very powerful voice in the world. And sometimes that's, one might argue, unfortunate, especially when it becomes violent. Most of the first world countries and countries that have embraced science and so forth are kind of moving away from that, and they think the only alternative they have is secularity, in the sense that, because I don't think secular is a bad word, it just means of the age, one might say zeitgeist, of the age, something that relates to that seculum, that period. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I like that term in that regard, but when it's used as a way to talk against religion, then, or spirituality, then I think that leaves us with just materialism and nihilism and things like that, and good people who haven't been pushed too hard. Just my opinion. So, getting back to Meg's question, so what do the teachings of quantum mechanics help us? How do they help us with regard to consciousness? So, as many of you may know, that Ask Sensei is my one of my primary podcast YouTube setups and channels, and so I address questions in a very brief format here that folks write in. But there's another thing you can join, and that is the Dragonfly Sangha, and that's a place where if people feel that these teachings have become very important to them, and they don't have a primary spiritual community, or even if they do, they want to be a part of this community that I founded, then they can join the Dragonfly Sangha by going onto the website senseitony.com, and they can become a member of the Sangha. So when you become a member of the Sangha, there's also a talk I do every week, and it's what I call Dharma talk, Dharma being the teachings of Buddhism. I do a Dharma talk, and there's a period of meditation. And then during our liturgical cycle, where there's big feasts or whatever, I will also give a special homily or talk with regard to that season. So there's lots of other reasons. You can interact with other people. You can have a sense of belonging to a community. You can take the precepts, which is a way to sort of formalize that relationship. And whenever we do retreats around the country, you will be invited to be a part of that experience. So I will talk, about Buddhist concepts. And one of the things I'm going to do in those Dharma talks or homilies, whatever you want to call them, sermons, whatever you want to call them, I will be using the language of science to help us understand important Buddhist concepts. So if you want to hear more about that, you can join the Sangha site. On our site, you can join the Sangha membership. So anyhow, getting back to Meg's question, I do want to address it briefly. So, Buddhism is an inquiry into the nature of mind. And in the great span of the Buddhist teachings that have lasted nearly 3,000 years, there were folks that came up with ideas that resonate very deeply with some contemporary thinkers. And one of those is the idea that consciousness is something primary or foundational in the universe, and that in some fashion everything has a participation in consciousness. And there might be different gradations or levels of the experience of this kind of consciousness, but that everything in some way participates in it. So I think that what quantum mechanics do is they give us correlations that we can work with to help us better understand the universe and better understand our place in it and so forth. I'm very careful when it comes to talking about science or talking about things like quantum mechanics that I follow the lead of important respected voices in the quantum science world. So I'm not just making my own inference about things. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes things can get a little flaky. And I really, I don't want to be a part of that. So if I talk about consciousness, I'm going to refer to writings or insights, experiments of scientists that are very well respected in the scientific community. So when I get into consciousness discussion, the person that I think of primarily, and so Buddhists have this idea that consciousness is everything, and that everything participates in consciousness, and that's sort of the ground of our being. And that this consciousness has certain qualities. And I think that's true for any Buddhist group. I mean, sometimes people will say, well, that's true for Buddhists of a certain ilk, but I think you can find in all the different Buddhist traditions references to this sort of unborn, undying consciousness, this luminous quality of awareness. And so there are a lot of studies in the scientific world that kind of have come up with a similar approach. So, for example, something that we readily talk about today and accept is a concept called quantum entanglement. And essentially, without getting too detailed, it's the idea that there is some kind of relationship, like if you take a particle of some sort and you split that particle, there's some kind of relationship between the two parts that seems to transcend our ordinary sense of time and space. And there seems to be some kind of consciousness between these two parts that defy our ordinary sense of how things work. And so it points to some sort of consciousness. And when you get into scientific studies like the double slit experiment, where you're kind of looking at the properties of how something can be both a wave or a particle. And, a lot of times they'll do that with light or photon energy. And, you come up with these crazy insights where, it seems like there's the ability for the, and this sounds wild, I know, but there's an ability for the future to be created by the past. And famous physicists like John Archibald Wheeler and his theory of retroactive causality, and in the way that they're doing some experiments with double slit process seems to indicate that he was on the right track. And then there's a whole school of physicists called the Copenhagen School, which is related to Niels Bohr and some other figures, and that their interpretation was that the observer who observes, like in a double slit experiment, that the observer changes the outcome. And that, it's connected to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And again, these are a lot of deep concepts that I don't really want to go into here per se, but it's basically the idea that the observer has a deep impact on the location of where something ends up. And there are certainly other schools of interpretation beside the Copenhagen one, but the Copenhagen one's a very legitimate one. And in that one, again, consciousness seems to be primary. Another theory by a gentleman named Robert Lanza is called biocentrism, and he kind of combines this idea of what's known in science as panpsychism, and that everything participates in consciousness in some way, perhaps even planets, large solar bodies and so forth, that Lanza, who's a brilliant scientist in his own right, although he doesn't typically, I don't think his field of endeavor was, pretty certain his field of endeavor wasn't particularly physics. He kind of combines panpsychism with a theory that has arisen called the many worlds theory, or multiple universe theory, which is integral to things like the string theory of the universe. And again, I don't want to go off on all these different concepts because there's such a plethora of information on these ideas that you can look up. But he kind of combines those and talks about how we exist in these infinite variety of universes, and that in some ways that you can talk about a multiplicity of experiences of consciousness, or that I exist in more than one universe at a time. That's very interesting, because then it's the idea that somehow my consciousness, my mind stream, is participating in a number of different realities at one time, and you can certainly very validly, I think, point to metaphors and imagery that you find in Buddhism, like in the Lotus Sutra, for example, that scripture, that kind of, there are parallels. And so, I think that when we're using science to communicate a spiritual concept, it's very important for us to be clear that this is a connection we're making because we find meaning in it. It doesn't mean that the meaning is there in itself, and I think that's important. And if you've heard my conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson, he emphasizes that, and I would agree with him on that. That essentially we are drawing this connection, this relationship. Does it really exist? I believe it does, but I'm also willing to admit that we don't ultimately know, and so what we're learning from the universe is something that we're drawing from it, which could involve projection, but it is very powerful and very helpful, and leads to very good pragmatic outcomes. So even if it is just an evolutionary adaptation, it just works really well. Particularly when spiritual concepts can be taught through scientific ideas. And then that leads me to people like Roger Penrose. And Roger Penrose, of course, is very much involved in the idea of consciousness. And I actually wrote about him. I had a brief interview with him when one of his books came out a year or two back. And it's, if you want to look it up, it's in a popular Buddhist journal called Lion's Roar, and it's called The Beginner's Mind of Sir Roger Penrose. I believe that's the title. And for him, he has using scientific thought, he considers himself an atheist, so this is not coming from any kind of religious perspective, but he definitely believes that, consciousness continues, and the experience of consciousness continues, and that the story goes on in some fashion. And he gets into a discussion with the person he co-wrote a paper on orchestrated organization, the Or theory, with Stuart Amoroff, who is an anesthesiologist, and he talks about microtubules, and the neurons and so forth, and how that might be our link to consciousness at a quantum level, and that those events occurring in the microtubules are quantum events, and that our consciousness, sort of like our radio. And this is my understanding of it, so I'm always happy to be corrected, but my understanding of it is that it's like, the radio waves are out there, and a radio picks up those waves, and I think more than that, affects the waves too. So that's where that analogy kind of breaks down a little bit. But I don't know, you could look at a ham radio maybe, or something of that nature. And you're able to pick up, or a CB radio, I guess you could say, not quite as good an example, but you're able to pick up varying levels of, depending on how sophisticated your radio is, you can pick up varying levels of communication. And so the analogy in Buddhism would be that we move from a sort of self-conscious awareness into a more universal consciousness, a oneness consciousness. Then we're picking up on something that's already there, and we're just picking up on it and participating in it. Not just picking up on it, but participating in it in a synchronistic way. So I hope that was helpful, Meg. I would suggest that you read my book, The Three Principles of Oneness. I would also suggest that you just keep reading and learning and studying. And some of those people I mentioned, look them up and kind of dig into it. It's really cool. It's really cool stuff. So thank you for your question.
You've been listening to Ask Sensei Tony. Please visit our website at AskSenseiTony.com, check out Sensei's books and videos, and become a part of the Dragonfly spiritual lifestyle.